Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome back from morning tea. Hope that you all had a good night last night and that you're all nicely refreshed. And like any MC, it's lovely to see people on time, so that you just keep an eye on that. I'll have some other housekeeping announcements at the conclusion of Chris Daniels' presentation. So just for the moment, it's just my pleasure to, pardon me, to, goodness gracious, 1 second. So it's my pleasure to introduce Gavin Woods, who is the President of the Rose Societies of Australia, and he is going to talk to you about this conference and about celebrating the rose in Australia. So I'll ask Gavin to please come back to the stage.
Yes, it's me again. Good morning again, fellow rose lovers. Can I ask you all one question? Is there something more worthy of celebration than the rose? I'm amazed to think that this humble flower has brought us all here today. Whatever the journey, whatever our background, we are united in our affection for the rose. When the title for our convention was chosen several years ago, little did we understand how our world would change and just how much we now have to celebrate. The world as we know it has changed inextricably and perhaps forever. The COVID-19 pandemic has touched us all. To many, our gardens have been a haven from the tragedy and trauma that surrounds us. The vaccination of the masses and the extraordinary effort made by our governments to bring this pandemic to some sort of control is cause for joy and celebration. Parts of our world remain in turmoil and conflict. Whilst we can only acknowledge the grief that portions of our globe is experiencing, including our own East Coast with recent flooding, this talk is about celebration of the rose, so please excuse me for my indulgence of that. We've all gathered in Adelaide to celebrate the world's most popular flower. Rose sales have skyrocketed worldwide. In Australia, cut flower roses, rose plants, bare root, and increasingly potted roses have reached record levels of sales. Nurseries have struggled to meet demand, something creating much celebration within the industry. Whether this is a direct result of the pandemic and homeowners' increased isolation is cause for debate. Whether it is a desire to be more in touch with nature and to experience the beauty that plants provide may never be known. It remains to be seen if this trend is sustained and roses remain the most popular flowering garden plant. Let us hope so. Australians never miss an opportunity for a party. The beer and barbecue image comes readily to mind. Our American friends may remember the Paul Hogan "throw another shrimp on the barbie" advertisement. This is a caricature. The reality is a little different. There may have been Rosarians on the First Fleet. The First Fleet was a fleet of 11 ships that brought the first European and African settlers to Australia. It was made up of 2 Royal Navy vessels, 3 store ships and 6 convict transports. On the 13th of May 1787, the fleet under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip, with over 1,400 people, consisting of convicts, marines, sailors, civil officers and free settlers, left Portsmouth in England and took a journey of over 24,000 kilometres and over 250 days to eventually arrive in Botany Bay, New South Wales, where a penal colony would become the first European settlement in Australia. There are almost certainly no roses accompanying the souls on that journey. They had more important issues like survival on their minds. It wasn't long, however, before roses appeared. At Hobart in Tasmania, responding to the cool climate, roses and geraniums were growing in abundance by the 1830s. The first Australian Horticultural Society had been established circa 1826 with popular social events held in elaborate marquees to shade the floral splendours. And so began our great love of the rose and of rose shows, that often being the focus of society activities in the early stages of the colony. The rose is used to celebrate all aspects of life, at births, deaths and marriages. A single rose can bring as much joy as an armful to the grateful recipients. Cut flower rose sales dramatically escalate for Valentine's Day, where red roses predominate. Our florist shops abound with roses, are mostly imported. We're grateful for the contribution of Meon International, arranging over 8,000 roses to be shipped to us from Kenya for this event. We're able to celebrate also the 2,000 beautiful roses from our island state Tasmania that will also grace the spectacle that is the Adelaide International Rose and Garden Expo and other events that you will all soon enjoy. It remains a fact that most of our new release roses originate from the houses of our top European breeders. We're thrilled that both Matthias Meon and Thomas Prohl have agreed to join us at this convention, as many of the top roses released each year in Australia come from the Meon and Cordes labels. It is true, however, that Australia has produced many worthy roses for a very long time. Speakers will cover this topic in depth on Monday. Suffice to say that the amateur rose breeding movement in Australia has steadily gained momentum to the point where new release roses can hold their own with the European introductions. Many of us will be part of the celebration at the National Rose Trial Garden Awards on Monday evening. The National Rose Society of Australia this year celebrates its 50th year. On November the 4th, 1972, a meeting of Rosarians representing all states of Australia was convened in Victoria to form the body which continues to guide our member groups to this day. A National Rose Society was first discussed in 1946. It only took 26 years to gain agreement to hold a meeting. We in Australia do not see the need to rush these things. Two of our most celebrated Rosarians were elected to key positions at that meeting, Dr. A.S. Fred Thomas as President and Mr. Jim Priestley as Secretary. It is this organisation that hosts our convention and of which I am proud to be the current President. Our Australian gatherings, our annual gatherings consist of a National Rose Show, various committee meetings and our annual general meeting. The Presidency rotates annually amongst the member states hosting the event, a wise move on the part of our predecessors for so many reasons. At those gatherings, we take the opportunity to celebrate our champions. A series of awards are presented to our alumni, representing recognition for outstanding service in the name of the rose. The Australian Rose Award, our gold medal, is presented to individuals who are deemed to have given outstanding service in any way to the rose. To quote our Constitution, in particular, any service which promotes knowledge, appreciation and enjoyment of the rose by the public shall be regarded as highly meritorious. Particularly noteworthy is the point that recipients are not required to be members of a Rose Society to be eligible. To date, 68 gold medals have been awarded, with 9 such medals to overseas rosarians. Quite a list for an organisation with 50 years of history. I cannot reveal any secrets, however, we may or may not be awarding a gold medal or 2 this year. You'll need to be at our national dinner tomorrow evening to find out. In addition to this award, we celebrate the achievements of members of both Australian and New Zealand societies with the awarding of the T.A. Stewart Memorial Medal. Only one award is made each year, and the award is administered by the Rose Society of Victoria and was first awarded in 1948, long before the National Society was inaugurated. A National Service Award is presented to Rosarians who have contributed at least 10 years of service to the NRSA. Only 9 individuals have received this award because we tend to wear people out long before the 10 years is up. Australia has 5 mainland rose societies which form the membership of the National Rose Society of Australia. The Rose Society of Tasmania was a founding member, but subsequently lapsed due to a diminished membership. It is worth noting, however, that Jim Kane is a Tasmanian and has been Treasurer of the National Society for over 22 years. He has well and truly qualified for his service medal. My own society, the Rose Society of South Australia, now celebrates 114 years of service to the rose. All our member groups are of similar vintage, with members of the Rose Society of Western Australia this year celebrating their 90th year. The highest award offered by our state societies is that of Honorary Life Membership. A highly coveted award. We do not hand this out lightly, and it is considered an immense honour to receive. We in Australia love rose shows. A great deal of time and effort is devoted by my own society in running 2 major shows each year, as well as providing conveners, exhibitors and judges to several other smaller events. The society established in the mother country, by, if I can call the UK that, by the Reverend Dean Reynolds Hole in 1887, was preceded in 1858 by the first National Rose Show. Only 50 years later, in 1908, a meeting here in Adelaide saw the formation of the National Rose Society of South Australia. There was no doubt as to the intentions of that society, and I quote, "The principal ideas of the society as stated were that the society's aim to be encourage all lovers of the rose in growing and exhibiting. Our aims have been somewhat moderated over the last 114 years to now read, to promote excellence and innovation in the promotion of the rose." Still, rose shows remain a very large part of our promotional activities. We believe that rose shows have an important educative role. Shows display roses produced from an excellence of culture, provide the public access to top rosarians, ensure lectures and demonstrations based on the culture and other aspects of rose enjoyment, and shows simply allow the public to smell the rose. Our shows often provide a source of new rose plants, of essential gardening tools and delicious delights to grace the tables of hungry rosarians. Floral design has been an important aspect of Australian rose shows for all time. As the form and styles of roses has evolved in the last 114 years, so has floral design. The trends in this field have been receptive to the public's needs. Now, largely gone are the tall pedestal arrangements requiring hundreds of blooms. Instead, often replaced with more innovative designs requiring far less flowers, because very few floral artists now have the large gardens in which their predecessors grew all their own material. Rose shows are a source of social discourse. Friends often only see each other at such events, where they can discuss not only the latest tragedies within their rose gardens, but can catch up on local news and gossip. Rose shows are no longer simply an outlet to allow type A personality growers to extend their bragging rights about their latest wins. I'm looking at Ted Morford here. Whilst rose shows no longer remain our sole focus, they continue to provide an important mechanism for promotion, fundraising, and a medium to showcase the rose in all its aspects. The National Rose Society is a proud member of the World Federation of Rose Societies. As is well recorded, and as Henri-Anne reiterated a little earlier, delegates met in London on July the 4th, 1968, as part of the 4th International Rose Conference to form our world peak body. Had that meeting been held in the United States of America, I'm sure the date would have created much greater fanfare than it did in London. It was the 4th of July, for those who didn't pick that up. Australia was represented by the aforementioned Dr. Fred Thomas, who was a globe-trotting rose phenomenon and did much to bring international affairs of the rose to Australia. Dr. Thomas was awarded the first gold medal of the Federation in 1979. Such was the regard held for him on the world stage. Our own David Ruston was there at that conference. He flew roses from his garden in Renmark some 20,000 kilometres to London, with flowers 100 hours in transit. David achieved a third prize in the floral arrangement section using these flowers. Quite an achievement. And I'm very sure that David celebrated this historical win with a stiff cup of English breakfast tea. The 8th World Rose Convention in 1998 was hosted by the Rose Society of New South Wales in Sydney. South Australian nurseryman Dean Ross was amongst the lecturers, whilst David Ruston did what he did best by staging a massive floral display depicting 200 years of the rose, and it was considered the highlight of the convention. During the spring of 2008, the Rose Society of South Australia hosted the World Federation of Rose Societies Regional Convention here in Adelaide. This formed part of our centenary celebrations. 370 delegates from 16 countries attended this well-organised event. Many of you, who were then in the flushes of youth, were present for that event. An Australian-bred rose was named Let's Celebrate to honour the theme of the convention and the Society's 100th year celebrations. Can you sense a theme here? We in Australia like a party. Rose trials celebrate emerging varieties from Australia and overseas. In 1992, the annual general meeting of the National Rose Society of Australia was held in Sydney, where it was decided to investigate the possibility of establishing a rose trial garden in Australia. This was deemed necessary as at least 95% of new roses introduced into Australia came from overseas breeders. Up to that time, each introducing nursery or agent undertook some sort of trial before new roses were released, and unfortunately, in many cases, this was insufficient for Australian climatic conditions. Experience had suggested that many overseas roses did not perform well when introduced to Australian conditions, or alternatively performed too well. For example, Graham Thomas, which is a fine shrub in England, is more suitable as a climber or pillar rose in Australia. By trialling these roses, it is hoped that the buying public can receive accurate information on how these roses will perform in Australia. In addition, the trial ground offers the opportunity to test and promote Australian-bred roses. At that initial meeting, 3 main parameters were set for the proposed garden. 1, it was to be within close proximity to a major city. 2, it was to be reasonably secure. And 3, it should provide free access to the public during daylight hours. Delegates from the various Australian states were asked to present their proposals at a meeting the following year. South Australia put forward a proposal which met all 3 criteria. It proposed the establishment of a trial ground within the gardens of the Adelaide Botanic Garden, which is within easy walking distance from the city centre, has free access and is reasonably secure. That proposal was accepted and its implementation was handed to the Rose Society of South Australia. Many delegates will have the pleasure of viewing our trial garden and attending the Rose Trial Awards ceremony, where we will celebrate the award winners of the latest trial. Our President Honorary Anne last week attended and opened the Riverland Rose and Garden Festival. Renmark, the birthplace of Australia's 2 World Federation presidents, is a place that truly celebrates the rose. The Riverland Rose and Garden Festival, established in 1994, draws people together over stunning roses, as well as providing opportunities to experience some of the best gardens, food and wine, and river recreation that the town and region has to offer. The festival has grown significantly over its 26-year history and now enjoys strong local, state and national popularity. The festival runs for 10 days with over 40 events taking place in all major towns in the Riverland district. Events include open gardens, markets, a flower show, dinners, gardening seminars and the Renmark floral display, with the 2022 theme being to honour the late Queen Elizabeth II. A few weeks ago, half of the entire world stopped to pay homage and to celebrate the extraordinary life of Queen Elizabeth. The longest-serving British monarch was laid to rest with a sheath of flowers containing roses from gardens of the royal palaces. I had to look really quite hard to identify any roses, but the commentators assured us they were there. We can recall the massive coffin sheath of Diana, Princess of Wales, containing only the white rose subsequently named for her. The rose was there in celebration of these 2 remarkable lives. Australia is the best place in the world to grow roses. I thought I might have to repeat that to wake you all up. Will I say it again? No. Australia is the best place in the world to grow roses. Of course, Australia is such a vast area with climatic variations that only parts of this country are ideally suited. We've long proclaimed Adelaide to be the rose capital of Australia. With cold winters free of snow and hot summers creating an environment that suits roses well, gardens embrace the spectacle that well-grown roses can provide. Curiously, there are no species roses indigenous to this country in a climate that is ideally suited to their culture. We're fortunate in this state to have a very cooperative and highly regarded horticultural media. For several years, one of our commercial radio stations has aired a segment called Rose of the Month, which is managed by a committee of the Rose Society of South Australia. In this segment, we honour the best roses for cultivation in our state. This year, World Federation of Rose Societies Hall of Fame recipients have been honoured, with last month being dedicated to the most famous of all roses. There's no prize, but can you all guess what rose that was? It was peace. Peace grows well in Australia and is still often seen in memorial parks as a living tribute, a tangible way to honour and celebrate the lives lost. We celebrate our gardens of excellence. 69 gardens worldwide have been awarded the Garden of Excellence accolade by the World Federation. Of those, 4 are in Australia, of which 3 are in Victoria. For those who are not aware, there is great rivalry between the states of Victoria and New South Wales, between Victoria and South Australia, in fact between Victoria and every other state and territory in this country. The 3 awarded Victorian gardens are fine examples and certainly deserving of the Garden of Excellence moniker. There is, however, a garden here in Adelaide equally worthy. Many of you will visit the International Rose Garden on Monday to participate in judging of the trial roses. It is the hope of many that this garden will be recognised as a Garden of Excellence also by the Federation. That will be truly worth celebrating. Australia celebrates our love of the rose by opening our best gardens to the public. Thousands enjoy the beauty and peace that only a rose garden can bring. We hold weddings and other events of significance in our most beautiful gardens. One such garden is that of Kay and Walter Duncan, named the Heritage Garden, located in the stunning Clare Valley. Many of you will have the thrill of visiting this garden on Sunday. Rated by past President of the World Federation, Steve Jones, as one of the 10 best private gardens in the world, you will surely not be disappointed with your visit. Walter and Kay not only have generously opened their garden for the enjoyment of the public on many occasions, but have donated tens of thousands of dollars in proceeds to charity. Surely something to celebrate. And Kay's here, I believe, so congratulations, Kay. Celebrations after the hours of midday may include a tipple or two of one's favourite alcoholic beverage. Our rose features in many different alcoholic styles, or at least the name rose does. Of course, there is rosé itself, a style of wine not wholeheartedly embraced in this country, but enjoyed by many chilled on a hot summer's day, perhaps best partaken in a rose garden itself. Of course, the hardened champagne drinker will know of the imperial rose selection of Moët and Chandon, truly a drink of celebration. Many rose-flavoured gins are now being produced. They are delicious, and remember, by drinking these, you're doing your bit to promote our flower. I've recently discovered a long list of rose-influenced cocktails, sure to please the most difficult critic. One such cocktail is featured at the bars of our convention hotel, La Vie en Rose. I've written I can't wait to try it, but I in fact did try it last night and can thoroughly recommend it. But what about rosé beer? Hard to believe, but it is true. In my view, to adulterate a great wine style with beer is sacrosanct. Beer lovers will proclaim the exact opposite is true. Surely an Australian phenomenon, I hear the European delegates mutter. But no, this is a worldwide trend. It's lightish and fruity, said a brewer. It's not dark and heavy or something you drink in the colder months. And I think people associate rosé wine with more lighter summer drinking fare, something akin to a delicious white wine. Perhaps we can all sample some during our tours during a stay in Adelaide. No? Oh well, remember you only live once. Diversity seems to be the catchword of the moment. Rose societies and rosarians in general have always practiced diversity. We have a great variety within our membership base. The World Federation of Rose Societies is a great example. A Belgian president, a British executive director and an Australian treasurer, with vice presidents from 11 different countries and committee chairs from another 8. Surely this is the United Nations of the flower world. Perhaps we should be asked to tackle some of the world's current problems. A rose society is a safe place where doctors and lawyers shake hands with labourers and the unemployed. Millionaires are considered equal to those with meagre incomes. Value is placed not in your job or your bank balance, but rather your appreciation and knowledge of the rose. This aspect of our hobby deserves celebration. As rose growers, we have much to celebrate. What garden plant can be purchased for the price of 4 cups of coffee, bloom for 8 months of the year, and produce hundreds of flowers for garden decoration or cut flowers? What garden plant is offered in so many colours and forms with such a range of new varieties released onto the market each year? What garden plant is grown across such a wide variety of climatic conditions and beloved by all who grow it, despite the challenges of their climate? New technologies and gardening techniques, as well as the improvements in genetics, have made the rose increasingly easier to manage and more attractive to gardeners of all persuasions. The humble rose, the flower much admired by us all, has brought us all here today. I sincerely hope that you enjoy your time with us in Adelaide. It is truly a time to celebrate. And thank you all very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Gavin, for that wonderful history of roses in Australia. And I'm sure that we've all learnt something out of that wonderful lecture. There was just one important part that was actually not included in Gavin's speech, and that is that based on his claim of Adelaide and Australia being the best rose-growing country in the world, there will be a debate over lunch in the room there, and of course he's up for that discussion. Now, so Gavin, thank you very much for preparing such a wonderful document, and enjoy that.
Oh, will
Wonderful.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I introduce our next guest, I wanted just to draw your attention to a couple of things. Firstly, Gavin mentioned also about those people who are going to visit Walter and Kay's garden. Kay was saying that the amount of rain that they've had recently means that the ground is really very soft. And she suggested that apart from very sensible shoes, that you might like to bring a spare pair of socks with you on Sunday. Sunday or Saturday? Sunday, thank you very much. The other thing that hasn't been sort of brought to your attention yet is the wonderful arrangements of flowers, of roses here, and you're going to see more of them out in the foyer when you head towards the expo, either later today or across the weekend. And I'm sure that we would like to pay tribute and to thank the Woodville Academy of Floral Design for these extraordinary displays. Are there any members in the room? No, they're all hard at work outside. Yes, here we are, yes. Oh, of course, Ruth, thank you. Wonderful. And Melanie, yes, there we are. Well, all their hard-working colleagues are outside preparing for the expo. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Chris Daniels. Chris has had a very distinguished career both here and in Australia. He is a well-published author and is consulted widely on a whole range of projects. He currently is the Chief Executive of the International Koala Centre of Excellence and a strategic advisor to the Cleland Wildlife Park, which many of you will be going to visit this afternoon. There, of course, is plenty of biography in this book. I don't plan to read it all, but now it's my pleasure to invite Chris to come to the stage.
Thank you very much. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here to talk to you today and to be part of this amazing convention conference. And I thoroughly enjoyed the welcome ceremony, although the image of Kelvin Trimper dancing is sadly something I'll take to my grave. But outside of that, it's been an extraordinary entrance, and thank you very much for involving me. I'm an ecologist, and as you know, ecologists are people who study the relationships between plants and animals and physical elements of their environment. And they also include wind and rain, various structures and so forth. And there's a lot of different aspects to ecology and this sort of relationships and the evolution of these relationships. And so I particularly like this picture here because that's often how we think about ecologists. But the one bit that's missing from this picture is urban ecology. And urban ecology is a relatively new approach to understanding relationships because it involves the cities and the communities and the townships and the villages. And we know that about 50% of people now live in large cities, and that percentage is increasing every day. So we have about 8 billion people on the planet at the moment, more than 4 billion live in cities. And it's within cities that they get their relationships with nature. So understanding that mix between the natural elements of a location where a city is, the endemic species of plants and animals that occur in that space, and the introduced types of plants and animals that we bring in, and then of course the structures that we build, our buildings, our houses, our towers, those sorts of things, all of those interact. And perhaps most importantly, the cities now are where people gain their connection with nature. So it's where they gain an understanding or an appreciation of nature. Sometimes it's around the natural elements of nature and the indigenous plants and animals. More often, it's about introduced plants that have become part of a particular cultural group. And you guys are absolutely part of that, having been a big proponent of roses. And roses are really important, along with many other plants, at that first introduction to communities, to nature. So this is a convention about roses, but actually it's a convention about urban ecologists and how people will form those initial connection with nature. So I'm really proud to be here because you are also urban ecologists, and we're going to go on a bit of a tour around that connection with nature and that role of the city and the village in building those relationships. Before I do that though, Kelvin has instructed me to give you a cook's tour of the flora and fauna of Australia, and also what we have done to it, which is kind of a sad story. So I'm actually going to finish also with what we are doing to improve it and to promote recovery for this continent. Australia, as you're well aware, is an island continent, so as a result has a huge number of different plants and animals that occupy this space that are found nowhere else in the world. We're home to over 500,000 different forms of plants and animals on land and in the adjacent marine environment. Even here in South Australia, about 90% of the things that are found in the oceans just off here are found nowhere else in the world. And we have this huge array of terrestrial animals with some 8,128, to be absolutely precise, vertebrate species, with 370 odd species of mammals, a large number of birds, reptiles, fish, and so forth. About 100,000 different species of invertebrates, animals without backbones, insects, crustaceans, those sorts of things. And the continent itself is home to almost 25,000 species of plants. It's an extraordinary array of different assemblages of plants and animals that we can find here. And every year they discover new species. So we are continually building upon this collection of plants and animals that are found nowhere else in the world. And as I've already said, much of our mixture is endemic. 93% of our reptiles are only found in Australia, and about the same with amphibians. About half our bird species are found only in Australia, and many of them are really unusual and in fact from Australia have spread to the rest of the world, much of it in the distant past. So Australia was the home of the songbirds, for example. So when first people arrived here from Europe some 200 years ago, they lamented the absence of songbirds, but in fact Australia was the origin of songbirds. It's just that many of ours are loud and raucous and squawk away and make a huge amount of noise. We also have some 70% of mammals that are found nowhere else in the world, and they include the only two egg-laying mammals, the echidna and the platypus. But probably the animals you most associate with Australia are the marsupials. And we're really lucky here to have a wide range, some 300 odd species of marsupials that occupy this continent. And they include things like the kangaroos, the bettongs, the carnivorous ones like the Tasmanian devil, and a really odd, weird little burrowing animal called the marsupial mole. And you're going to experience a lot of these animals when you come up to Cleveland. We have a remarkable collection of South Australian animals up there for you to experience and come in contact with. The marsupials are different from all of the other mammals because they carry their young in pouches. And pouches come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. You're probably most familiar with the kangaroo, of course. The wombat has a pouch that faces backwards so that when it's digging, the pouch doesn't fill with dirt. And then there's a whole array of other sorts of pouches. But that's that absolutely indicative feature of the marsupial. They actually evolved in the Northern American continent and spread to South America about 100 million years ago, and then from there through Antarctica to Australia about 50 million years ago. And then Australia broke off from Antarctica, and our marsupials have radiated to be quite a special group of animals. The most special of them all is the koala. It's a truly wonderful and amazing animal, and those of you coming up to Cleveland will have an up-close and personal experience with koalas. Can I urge you, please, to not refer to them as bears? So a bear is a large, furry animal that can climb trees with really sharp teeth and really sharp claws. A koala is a large, furry animal that can climb trees with really sharp claws and really sharp teeth. Bears will eat you. Koalas, that's not very likely. So your chance of being consumed by a koala is incredibly small. I won't totally rule it out because some amazing things have happened with koalas, but you will have a beautiful up-close and personal experience with koalas. We don't call them bears for the obvious reasons, although many people do, and sometimes our staff get really frustrated, and we've been known to throw repeat offenders to the dingoes if you keep doing that. So you can really impress all the staff at Clearly when you go up there by saying it's a koala, not a koala bear. And of course, we have this tremendous number of spectacular plants within the Australian continent, some 24,000 species. The ones you'd be most familiar with, of course, are the eucalypts. There's some 600 or more species of eucalypt in a couple of genera, what we call gum trees, and they're kind of the iconic landscape plant. The other two that are really well known are the acacias, the wattles we call, and the wattle is the symbol of Australia. And then there are also the proteaceae, the banksias, a really beautiful collection of plants. But we also have a wonderful selection of orchids, many that occur in our particular location, and you'll see some of those up at Cleveland as well, and lots of other types. Again, the level of endemism here is spectacular because it is an island continent. So we wind up with 92% of the vascular plants are found nowhere else on Earth. And there you can see a bit of a breakdown when we compare the pine trees, the gymnosperms, the flowering plants, ferns and so forth. So if you want to see really, really different types of plants, you've come to the right spot. And actually, Adelaide itself is very special when it comes to both ecosystems and the flora and fauna that occupy our space. You'd be aware here that Adelaide is here in the state of South Australia. You obviously know that because you got here. It's an unusual city in many ways. It is a long, skinny city that is perched on Gulf St Vincent, and it was established in 1836. It was established to be a province of the United Kingdom under a plan developed by Edward Gibbon Wakefield. And he was an extraordinary fellow who worked out how to make a lot of money selling land the other side of the world to unsuspecting Brits, really. He came up with this idea while he was in jail. He was serving a 3-year sentence for abducting a 15-year-old heiress. It wasn't that was the big problem, it was the second time he's done it, so he kept... Anyway, while he was there, he came up with a plan, set up the South Australian Company and sold the land, and people came out here and established the colony of South Australia. It is different in so many ways. Unlike all the rest of Australia, we do not have any convicts in our past, so we're all clean, pure, upstanding people here, unlike the Victorians, as we've already heard. So it was established here, and it was established as a major farming community, was exporting produce back to the UK within 20 years. It worked really well because Adelaide is largely a floodplain, all of this area here that is well occupied, and it has on its eastern boundary the Adelaide Hills or the Adelaide Ranges here. Now these are amazing structures with a very sheer westerly face, and they are dominated by a giant, giant mountain that is 600 metres tall. It's the second tallest. It's beaten by some tiny little mountain right up in the north. Yeah, 600 metres. I love saying that's our tallest mountain. Many of you here, they wouldn't even rate as a pimple here. So what do we call it? We call it Mount Lofty, and I think that goes to the Australian sense of humour that we have a Mount Lofty here. And in fact, Cleveland Wildlife Park is up adjacent to Mount Lofty. So we have this westerly this easterly mountain range with a sheer westerly face. The rain hits there, rushes down onto the plain, which is a black soil plain for most of the area there, and it's carried down by a wide array of creeks and streams and rivulets. And so this unusual geographic structure actually created a network of different environments depending on where you are in the landscape. So up to the north, where the hills are quite away from the coast, you have big open areas that was an open woodland called a mallee woodland or grasslands, and many of the low-lying areas there, the green bits here, are mangrove swamps and samphire swamps. On the Central Plains itself, where all of this water was carried down from the Mount Lofties, there were large wetlands, reed beds here, and a series of other different types of open woodland and then closed woodlands up in the hills themselves. So we had 6 different forms of environment here, just in this one particular area, from reed beds through to the creeks and streams, the open woodlands, that's the mallee woodland there with the calitris pine, up there the other form, the grey box woodlands, the samphire, and it was all ringed with a line of sand dunes. So this created an extraordinary set of microenvironments, all in the city itself. And each of these had their own collection of plants and animals, and so Adelaide was a biodiversity hotspot. A biodiversity hotspot's a location that has a disproportionate number of species of plants and animals for an area that it occupies. So the Adelaide metropolitan area has about 30% of the state's plant species, about 60% of the state's birds, and then 20 to 25% of the state's reptiles, amphibians and fish and mammals, all in an area that's a tiny fraction of 1%. If we could have actually made a national park that best reflects the biodiversity of the entire spot, the place to do it would have been the city of Adelaide. But we didn't do that. And that brings me to my sad part of the story, which is what have we done here? And what have we done on the planet versus what have we done in South Australia? And what are the mess that we got into it? And of course, I'm an ecologist, and so I'm a strong believer in oxymorons. You know oxymorons: fun run, military intelligence, tame cat, tasty vegetables. They're all sorts of... My particular favourite is Hyundai Excel. But anyway, there's the great oxymoron, of course, is the happy environmentalist, because we've done so much to the planet. To summarise what we've done, I've got 4 slides, 4 graphs. I'm a scientist, I have to use graphs, it's in my contract. And here's the first one. The first great challenge that the planet faces is the massive increase in population. We are seeing it's an exponential increase. So when I was born in 1960, there were about 3.6 billion people on the planet. When my father was born in 1932, there were just over 2 billion. So it had been a slow increase. By the time I turned 50, we were up at almost 7 billion. Now we're at 8. And if by some miracle I reach the age of 90, we'll hit 11 billion people. And this huge press of humanity has had a devastating effect on the number of species of plants and animals that occupy our space with us. So the green line there shows the disappearance of species. And most of it has happened really within my lifetime, our lifetime. And it continues. This graph from World Wildlife Fund shows the number of animals in a population of a species that would be quite a large, traditionally a very well-doing species. So World Wildlife Fund looked at 4,000 species across the world, each of which had populations of over 20,000 in 1970. So that includes herds of wildebeest, deer, those sorts of animals in particular. And what they found is that number has dropped by 60%, 68% it is there, for each of those 4,000 different species. So where there were 10,000 animals, there are now 4,000 to 5,000 animals. Where there were 1,000, there's now 400. So we're seeing this massive decrease in the number of animals. And this is actually leading to what we call an extinction cliff, a whole mass of species that will suddenly go extinct because we're just running out of beasts. But that's wild beasts. It's not actually the tonnes of meat on the planet. What we have seen here is this massive increase in the tonnage of meat on the planet from 10,000 years before the current epoch up to predicted at 2050. So the green bars here are wild animals. So 10,000 years ago, there were about 200 million tonnes of life walking across this planet. Elephants, wildebeest, deer, lions, tigers, and so forth. By 1900, the amount of wildlife had dropped to 1/10 of that number. And we had seen the big increase here in domestic animals, primarily farm animals, particularly goats, sheep, cattle, and so forth, and us. We have started to become a really significant impact on the earth in terms of tonnage. By 1950, we're up over 400 million tonnes, primarily us and our domestic animals. By the year 2000, we're up to 900 million, and then by 2050, we'll be looking at 1,400 million tonnes of life on the planet, almost exclusively us and our domestic animals. And of course, these put enormous pressures on the reserves and the resources of the planet, and you can see the carrying capacity declining there over time as a result. So we're getting greater desertification and damage to ecosystems. And this is a worldwide picture, but it also applies very much to our landscape. So we're sitting on this biodiversity hotspot, this extraordinary collection of natural environments. What did we do with them? Well, we pretty much cleared them. We have less than 3% remnant vegetation remains in the Adelaide metropolitan area and about 10% across the Mount Lofty ranges. And you can see here the different disappearances, the bit that's remaining. Primarily it was grassy woodland. We have only a tiny proportion of that left. The grasslands, the mallee, the wetlands, there's a little bit left. Coastal cliffs have almost gone. And so forth. So there's been a really extensive clearance for our natural environment just in our own location. Coupled with that, of course, we keep introducing stuff that goes feral. Currently, we have about 1,500 species of native plants, and we've introduced about the same number, 1,500 species of plants to match. And many of these have become weeds of national significance. So we have poplars, ash, olive trees, soursobs, those sorts of things are now found pretty much everywhere. So it's a real competition now between the remaining endemic species and the introduced ones. And we're not alone here. Across the continent, these sorts of changes have happened at enormous pace. And you can see here the disappearance of plants. And here's the flora here. Almost 1,400 species have either disappeared or are likely to disappear. And you can see the totals here, pretty high for all of the animal species. And when you look at it as a percentage of the total, you particularly note that birds and mammals and some plants have been devastated. We have the greatest extinction record for mammals of any place on Earth. Yay. It's something we should be deeply ashamed of. These extinctions are not just an issue for us because we're losing biodiversity, but they have a number of really important other relationships that change the way the community operates. The first is, of course, that the disappearance of biodiversity powerfully affects the ability to generate our own food and retain productivity of the landscape. So by way of example, we've extensively cleared the Mount Lofty ranges. You can see initially on the green graph, this was the landscape in 1836. By 1945, the area had been very, very extensively cleared for all sorts of different agriculture and to create the food bowl. By 1972, most of the vegetation had gone except for a handful of national parks. So this incredible clearance to enable a very broad array of agriculture was at one level really good. South Australia was exporting lots of different sorts of food and was able to also look after itself during times of depression and war. However, as you start to clear these particular areas, you also remove many of the animals that use the plants and animals for home. So here you can see the decline of the woodland birds, which is one of our great challenges here, and they are decreasing in terms of species and of number. Many of these will be pollinators, and a great many of them are insect eaters, and so we're really important in maintaining a stable ecosystem. So what we see then is, as we clear these areas, we remove the birds. So removal of the habitat removes the birds. This means you're removing the pollinators, so the plants can't actually regenerate, and you also allow the bugs that eat the plants to build up and take over the landscape. And so they then wind up consuming the remaining plants, and you get into a negative feedback system where the land becomes exceedingly damaged. And we unfortunately did a lot of this. We've seen the disappearance of many of our little insect and pollinating birds, and this creates desertification. It's not something that's only found in South Australia. It is something that's found all across the world and is a major contributor to the collapse of worldwide ecosystems. The second thing it does is that it creates that disconnect between our communities and nature. So we wind up with people disconnecting and therefore not understanding nature. And one of the big issues we have in Australia is that people have developed a fear of the environment. So many of you who've arrived here have probably only seen Australian nature as portrayed by many of those TV documentaries which portray Australia as full of the most lethal things you can find anywhere in the world. And in fact, if you were to come to Australia, you're not going to last very long, because the snakes will kill you, and we've got more deadly snakes than any other place on earth. If they don't get you, the spiders will. If the spiders don't get you, the sharks will get you, or the blue-ringed octopus, and any other of these sorts of animals will come in and wreak havoc. If it isn't the animals, then it's going to be fire, and you'll all get roasted, and then even our trees fall on us when we're not looking. So we develop this kind of irrational fear of wildlife and of nature, and that nature needs to be excluded. Ironically, it isn't true that wildlife will get you. Whilst we do have some fairly nasty spiders and snakes, they actually are very timid and tend to keep away from people, and we have very few actual instances where people interact with wildlife. What kills people, what animals kill people, is cows. We have quite a large death rate from cows. We don't usually like to say it because it doesn't make us sound terribly cool, does it? And if it isn't cows, then it tends to be sheep or goats, so don't trust a goat. And in fact, the animals that particularly take human life here in Australia are cows, horses and bees. The other animals rank incredibly low on the list. So you can't blame wildlife for creating various issues, but we do, and therefore we have, sadly, as is a worldwide trend, created communities that have excluded nature. And a number of these, you don't see any of those beautiful gardens or beautiful parks because of this kind of irrational fear that nature is out to get you. And that if you put in a garden, well, then it will be full of animals that will just want to eat you, your children, your dogs, and everybody you love. So you build places like these, and these are a real challenge because they challenge our sense of place and our sense of belonging to a community, which is why gardens are so incredibly important. And that's why your work in promoting roses is a very gentle, magnificent introduction for communities like this who do not necessarily feel it's important to have nature in their own space. Some of these are not from Australia, but the top right-hand corner one, this one, is about 40 kilometres away from here down in the south. And this ignorance leads to quite a number of challenges that we're just starting to grapple with. Richard Louv wrote Last Child in the Woods, where he documented within the US that there were now generations of kids who hadn't ever climbed a tree, who hadn't gone roaming in a park, who hadn't ever collected a tadpole or spent any time at all in nature. And there was quite a lot of physical and mental sequelae to these as well. These children were more anxious, were more depressed, they were physically weaker because they were spending more time inside watching computer games or shooting Nazi zombies with a friend in Finland rather than getting out and spending time outside. The biophilia hypothesis was also that beautiful demonstration that we need nature. And I'm preaching to the converted here because you're well aware of the physical and the mental improvements that you do spending time outside, whether it be in a garden or whether it be in a park or on the ocean or anywhere where you spend time with nature. Stephen Kellett and Edward O. Wilson called this the biophilia effect, that we actually evolved in nature and that we need nature for our own well-being. Then this is really weird for so many reasons. Most importantly, biodiversity has a huge array of effects that are really, really beneficial at so many levels. So biodiversity does a number of things. The first thing it does, of course, is it improves resilience and sustainability for ecosystems. And I've already demonstrated what happens when you get collapse, but a powerful, well-structured ecosystem is not only able to support itself, but enables a system to recover after challenge. So when we have droughts and flooding rains, a strong biodiverse ecosystem is able to recover and re-establish. And we do see that in parts of Australia now responding to both the flood and the fires from a couple of years back. The richer, more established, more sustainable areas, richer in biodiversity, are much more able to recover. And of course, we get our food and we get our medicines from biodiversity. So we need to be maintaining biodiversity because we need a lot of those products in order to sustain ourselves. Just yesterday, you may have seen on the news that they'd discovered a new cure for cancer from some octopus slime. Now, I wouldn't have thought you'd be starting immediately to look for cancer cures by homogenising an octopus, but it appears you can, and it's been very successful. So we can never be quite sure where we will get these solutions. And of course, biodiversity provides a major income stream through tourism, through recreation, and through spending time outdoors. And in fact, the natural tourism is incredibly important for Australia. Even when you just look at koalas, these amazing animals, they were worth, as calculated in 2014, $3.2 billion to the Australian economy. They employed some 30,000 jobs, whether it be in the parks, the ranger system, the park system, the private park system, the eco-tours, a whole array of different businesses actually profit and support our economy by connecting people with nature. And then it's always been a fabulous way to promote Australia generally. Every visiting politician or famous person is automatically given a koala to hold for the standard photographs, as you can see here. A couple of famous characters, and we've got Ronnie Woods here and Katy Perry here. When they came out and came up to Cleveland, they're given a koala to cuddle. This picture, incidentally, had 1 million hits within about 24 hours, I think, around the world, written up in the Daily Mail, and we had a huge increase in visitation to Cleveland Wildlife Park because everybody wanted to hug the koala that hugged Katy Perry. The second thing is that the natural environment creates a sense of place, and you get different forms of sense of place with different forms of environment. So you can have a strongly cultural base to a sense of place, and we see this with cultivated gardens. You see it with roses. You see it with a lot of those sorts of organisations and communities that have become very attached to particular types of plants. It's also very much a part of the natural ecosystem, and our connection with nature is very much driven, very much makes us who we are and enables us to become our own community as South Australians, as Australians. In other words, we are who we are because of our interaction with nature. And one good example of this is the spiders. We have fantastic spiders here, and I do hope you get to see some of our huntsmen. They're really huge things. They're about the size of my hand, really beautiful, big, hairy, 8-legged, gorgeous creatures. And in fact, they're found pretty much throughout Adelaide. Most people in Adelaide have had some form of experience with a huntsman. They tend to come into our house, get in under the pictures, and in fact, Adelaideans, as do many other people around Australia, have kind of a patented way of getting rid of huntsmen. You actually take a cup and a sheet of paper, push the sheet of paper up from the cup, trap the spider, take it outside and let it go. It's really cool. Usually when I do that sort of example to Australians, everybody starts smiling. They've all got some sort of experience. They've seen that, they've seen Dad do it, or they've seen Mum do it. They've done it themselves, and they smile with their own experience of dealing with this beautiful big spider. I gave this example to a group of 28 visiting mayors from China a few years ago, and they looked at me like I had gone mad. I was totally insane to be smiling about this giant, great big huntsman thing. They could not imagine anything worse, and I may well have set back relations between Adelaide and China by about a decade with that example. Our sense of place, we smile at that and we live with it. Their sense of place, totally different. But it's not just us that has a sense of place with nature, it's actually the world. And we know this. It was really brought to mind by two things. Firstly was COVID, and in fact being locked away because Adelaideans had parks, backyards, gardens. We were able to get outside, and that helped us through the terrible situation that was going on around the world. Communities trapped in tall buildings, 30-storey apartment blocks with no access to nature really struggled. And even elsewhere in Australia, there were a lot of challenges for people living in those styles of high-density accommodation. The second thing that happened, it was in 2019 to 2020, where bushfires swept the world. There were horrendous bushfires in the western part of the US, as some of you will know, through the Mediterranean. The Amazon burnt and had one of its worst bushfire seasons it has ever had. There was a huge fire in Siberia, parts of which are still going. The world was on fire. And Australia caught fire in August of 2019. By the time the fire finished in effectively the end of January, 2% of the continent had burnt. 21% of Australia's forests were gone, and the continent was devastated. Most of the other places were suffering very similar, sometimes even worse impacts onto their biodiversity, but they didn't get much coverage. The Australian fires got huge international coverage and continuous to the point where people were sending huge amounts of money. The reason we got all of the coverage and the rest of the fires didn't was pictures like this. So this little guy, like all koalas, if you live in a tree in a bushfire, your life expectancy is greatly reduced. Koalas have really, really thick, dense fur, which actually helps protect them, but their hands and feet do suffer. Koalas were devastated across their whole range, some, particularly in South Australia. Some 40,000 koalas were killed on the Kangaroo Island bushfires, and about 20,000 in the Mount Lofty Ranges at a place called Cuddly Creek. Lots of people really chipped in to rescue koalas, particularly baby ones like this one, and bandaged feet pictures circulated the world and got millions of hits. And that's what led to the great influx of funding that came to rescue organisations across Australia. But people wanted to do more than that. Rather than just sending money, they wanted to help. So what they did, they got knitting. And people knitted and knitted. They knitted joey pouches, they knitted joey gloves for the baby koalas, and they knitted birds' nests. Huge numbers of birds' nests, from tiny little ones the size of egg cups through to ones you could put an ostrich in. I don't know what they were thinking that needed that sort of thing, but they knitted and then they shipped them out. I was running Cleland Wildlife Park at the time, which is a park owned by the Department for Environment and Water, and we had sent 3 teams to Kangaroo Island, rescued a large number of koala joeys that they'd lost their mothers and were really struggling. And so we wound up with pallets of these knitted things arriving every day. We had no way of knowing what to even do with tens of thousands of knitted birds' nests or joey mittens. So for those of you going up to Cleland, if you'd like some, if you feel you need a hand-knitted bird's nest, we've got some for you. But it shows that people wanted to do something, they wanted to be involved, they wanted to participate, and they wanted to change the world. So we actually do have a world focus now on Australia because they're seeing their environmental sense of place as a being illustrated by what happens in Australia. And koalas actually became a symbol of hope too, and of recovery, because the news was so bad that people needed a good news story. And in fact, the koalas that we rescued and have to Cleveland, and some of you might be able to see our program up there, were maintained and enabled to thrive because the army came up and looked after them. Here we've got one of our wonderful keepers, Ashley Hunter, who instructed the army on how to feed koalas. And the armies loved it. They came up at 9, 12 and 3 every day, 7 days a week for 6 weeks to feed the baby koalas. And actually they needed it because many of them suffered from quite a deal of stress as a result of dealing with the huge death that was associated with the bushfires. So this picture here had 15 million shares across the world within the first 2 weeks, picture taken by the army, because it's a great news story. And in fact, those koalas survived and are doing well, as you will see when you get up there. So these pictures can also enable us, through our sense of place, to feel that we can recover from these terrible, disastrous situations. And so there is actually enormous hope, and South Australia in many ways is leading the fight to recover from these incredibly difficult situations, and much of it is driven by our sense of place. But what we've got to do, as Kelvin always says, there are 3 things. We have to support habitat, we have to support science and education, and we have to manage well. There are 3 things in the manage well as well, so I feel like I've got a lot of good brownie points from Kelvin. The first is habitat. We do identify really important areas and we celebrate them. So Cleveland has just been admitted into the Queen's Commonwealth Canopy. This is a collection of the great forests of the Commonwealth. There are some 52 countries in the Commonwealth. 48 have now Queen's Commonwealth canopies recognised. It has to be a forest of international significance, which also has very strong economic and social ties to community. There are only 3 in Australia, 1 in South Australia. The only genuine forest one is here out in South Australia in Cleveland. And so when you jump on the bus, have a look at the spectacular forest that you will see as you arrive there. This also links to a whole array of other parks all through the Mount Lofty Ranges. The second is science and connection. And again, I'm preaching to the converted here. You're already deeply connected with nature through your love of roses and your championing of roses. The stories you tell about roses are the stories of nature, so you are able to bring community in to actually appreciating the importance of nature, so we don't wind up with communities, as I've illustrated here, which don't have any. It's also very important that stories are told about how wonderful biodiversity is, that we are losing it, but we can do a lot to recover it. And we have a lot of programs here that directly connect people with nature. The third is to recover. The land will recover if we give it half a chance. And South Australia have got some wonderful recovery programs. Here's some at a place called Tunkillo, just at the back blocks of the Mount Lofties, that were incredibly devastated through very poor farming practice. Well, the farmers there have, over a 30-year period, really worked, or 25 to 30-year period, really worked hard to recover these landscapes. And now you wouldn't recognise them from devastated, water-eroded spaces that they were. Much of this recovery is about controlling ferals. We have a lot of feral plants and animals, goats, foxes, rabbits, and a lot of plants like bufflegrass. Controlling those does lead to spectacular recovery. We need to manage pollution. You would be aware that plastics are now the scourge of the landscape. We have giant plastic islands in the ocean and the single-use plastics, and then the breakdown of plastics to make microplastics remains an enormous challenge for us. But South Australia has excellent container legislation, so you get 10 cents back for most of your bottles, cans, cartons. We have now banned single-use plastics, and so we use much more sustainable, recyclable materials. This starts to make a huge difference, and removing the plastic islands, plastic mountains, is an incredibly important way to save the planet. And then we take a multidisciplinary approach to recovery for plants and animals. We often refer to this as survival science. Yes, we have to find habitat, and you put a fence around it, and that will keep that piece of habitat. That's good, but it's not enough because other things get into it and the habitat becomes isolated. So we need to also control ferals. We need to do recovery for landscape, as I've just said. We are actively involved in rewilding, so breeding animals for release back into nature, managing and understanding pest plants and animals, managing and understanding disease and parasitism, and engaging the community. Everything about nature now is about engaging community. It's always about people. There's so many of us. We have so much influence on the world. We have to engage people through citizen science projects and through other sources. And we need to recognise the climate is changing. We need to do everything possible to mitigate those changes, but that will lead to animals doing well in places they were never found before, or doing more poorly in areas that they used to thrive. Same thing applies for plants. We run a risk of losing most of the eucalypts from Queensland as they pass the 2-degree climate change increase, which means the koalas in Queensland are incredibly challenged. So we have to actually think about where we might keep biodiversity in the face of climate change. All of these are challenges that we wrestle with. Cleland now is leading the South Australian charge towards survival science, towards integrated management of plants and animals. And you'll see that when you're up at the park later this afternoon. The final point that actually I really want to make is about Green Adelaide. This connection to nature is so important that it's become inculcated in our way of life as a city community. In 2020, the state government created the Green Adelaide Landscape Board. And this is a board, and Kelvin Trimper sits on this board, which is charged to raise money as a levy from all of the householders, the landowners in the city. And this money is put towards improving the nature of the city, improving our connection with nature in a variety of different ways. The image, if you like, is captured by this Kaurna artist, Alan Sumner, who created the Kaurna, the Aboriginal people's view of what a modern city should look like. You can see the buildings and the communities. These little half circles here represent people and communities gathered together. He also has the buildings and the city, but in it he has the parklands and the greenery, the oceans, wetlands, trees and nature. So our view of Green Adelaide is that nature is a crucial part of creating a vibrant and sustainable community. And much of that has been included in our recent pitch to become a national park city. And December last year, Adelaide became only the second national park city in the world. And we're incredibly proud of that because our connection through front yards, backyards, local parks to the wider natural area is incredibly important for our community. And it is now recognised and championed around the world. And this national park city approach enables us to really deal with many of the other big problems. So we're in the process of turning the River Torrens, just out the back here, from this, as it was in the 1920s and 30s, to a vision like this. And we want to bring back one of these little animals, the platypus, the egg-laying mammal, which was here in the 1880s. We hunted it out. Now we might be able to bring it back into an urban river. So these sorts of concepts enable our community to grapple really big projects and actually really be able to recover. It's not without its challenges, and in fact dealing with nature in a city is often described as herding butterflies, because every time you do one thing, something weird and wonderful happens to challenge you again. I particularly like this example. These are corellas. They're birds that are really common now within the city. They're really smart parrots, and they've moved in about 10 to 15 years ago and can be found here in large numbers. They're really smart. So they have worked out on a cold day where to go to find warmth. And it turns out that red traffic lights are incredibly popular as warming spots for these corellas. So here's a pair sitting in the traffic lights at 9 o'clock on a weekday morning, warming themselves, completely oblivious to all of the other cars banging into each other below because they couldn't see whether the lights were working or not. So yeah, we got plenty of challenges to face, and it's all about continually trialling something and then adjusting as you move forward. So we are well on the way to moving from a devastated landscape, these were koalas killed in the fires of 2019, to living with koalas in our backyards. We have about 120,000 koalas now found throughout metropolitan Adelaide and the Adelaide Hills. We are living with one of the most extraordinary, most loved animals on earth. It's probably in the top 3, was elevated to number 1 as a result of the fires. And we've got them, and it's something we are incredibly proud of. And if we can do all of this, then yes, I would be a happy scientist, and the oxymoron won't apply. Thank you very much. That's spot on, Chris.
Fantastic. So, ladies and gentlemen, what a privilege we've had.
Thank you.
Chris is a city treasure, a state treasure, a national treasure, and an international treasure. You can hear his passion and his intellect and his ability to actually put all of this science into language that we all understand. And so, Chris, thank you so much for that wonderful lecture.
Thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll see everybody up at Cleveland.
Yes. So Chris will be hoping to see people at Cleveland this afternoon. So ladies and gentlemen, before you leave, just a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. Firstly, please remember to wear your lanyard. It will get you into everywhere that you need to go. Secondly, the expo, for those who aren't going to Cleveland this afternoon, the expo opens at 4 o'clock across the foyer, and of course then we'll be open tomorrow, Saturday and Sunday. For those who are going to Cleveland this afternoon, the buses leave at 1:15, which is just about 45 minutes away. So I encourage you to move fairly quickly into Hall D for lunch, and then for those who are going to assemble out in the main foyer near the glass doors, and then you'll be ushered to your bus. And I think that is all. For those who aren't going on to Cleveland this afternoon, please enjoy your time in Adelaide. And just a reminder that this conference across the next 5 or 6 days operates very much on the basis of everybody keeping to their time. So be on time and we will be able to keep everything running smoothly. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a lovely day. Enjoy your lunch and enjoy Adelaide. Good afternoon. Thank you.